The United States of America. For 8 decades, this name has been synonymous with the pinnacle of global power. It has been the indispensable nation, the guarantor of international order, and the architect of unparalleled economic and military dominance. Its flag has flown over every major conflict, its currency has been the anchor of global finance, and its culture, the dominant narrative of the modern world. Yet beneath the veneer of invincibility, a devastating truth is being written. No empire is eternal. History is not a series of unique events, it is a relentless loop of patterns. And the American empire is now following a fatal, predictable trajectory, one already carved into the ruins of Rome, the crumbling foundations of the British Empire, and the silent collapse of the Soviet Union. The question is not one of opinion, but of mathematics and historical certainty. We are not witnessing the beginning of the end, but the final accelerating stages of a collapse that has been underway for decades. The evidence is no longer hidden in dusty archives. It is quantified in every budget deficit, every devalued dollar, and every broken promise. The final act of the American empire is now being performed. This is the detailed chronicle of the 5 stages of imperial decline and how the United States has passed the point of no return. The analysis must begin where all great collapses begin, with the intoxicating lure of uncontrolled growth. Every empire's journey toward collapse begins paradoxically at the moment of its greatest perceived triumph, uncontrolled expansion. Driven by a hunger for land, resources, or ideological control, the empire stretches its boundaries and its resources past the point of sustainable management. What begins as destiny soon morphs into a crippling sickness. The Roman Empire, starting as a minor city-state, eventually controlled 60 million people across 3 continents. Its legions were legendary, but its ambition was ultimately its undoing. The continuous military machine began to devour the state. By the 2nd century AD, the Roman military consumed approximately 2/3 of the state's total revenue. Every new conquest demanded a new fortress, a longer supply chain, and another garrison, transforming expansion from a source of wealth into an unbearable logistical and financial burden. Rome could not stop growing because it was too proud to retreat. Its size became its greatest vulnerability. 17 centuries later, the British Empire adopted the same toxic blueprint. Rising on the back of the Industrial Revolution, Britain achieved global naval and economic dominance. Its map was literally drenched in red ink, a visual testament to its sprawling dominion. However, the cost of defending this vast territory, from rebellions in India to distant naval expenditures, was simply unsustainable. The British believed expansion meant permanence, leading directly to the structural failure of its financial system. The United States has perfected the art of the invisible empire. Today, the US maintains approximately 750 military bases in over 80 countries, a military footprint far exceeding that of any empire in history. This global presence, intended to project stability and power, has instead become a constant draining hemorrhage of resources. The cost is not measured in conscription, but in trillion-dollar budgets that are barely questioned. The wars in the Middle East and the constant maintenance of distant outposts have stretched the military to its limit and, more critically, eroded domestic focus. America protects borders thousands of miles away while its own infrastructure crumbles and its domestic economy struggles under massive debt. The most dangerous delusion of this stage is the belief that growth is infinite. The higher an empire rises, the harder and more devastating the inevitable fall. The current structure of the American empire, built on the premise of perpetual war and boundless military reach, has crossed the Rubicon. It is too big to manage, too proud to retreat, and ultimately too heavy to carry. This overreach directly precipitates the second, more insidious stage, currency debasement, the slow erosion of trust. When expansion costs more than taxes can fund, emperors and politicians inevitably seek the shortcut of financial alchemy. For centuries, the Roman denarius was the bedrock of global commerce. It was stability cast in metal. However, to fund endless wars and maintain the legions, emperors began systematically reducing the silver content of the coin, replacing it with cheaper copper. What began as a 10% dilution escalated rapidly to 90% copper by the 3rd century. This massive systematic fraud shattered public faith. Prices skyrocketed hyperinflation as merchants demanded more and more worthless coins for the same goods. The empire was not conquered by barbarians, it was debased from within. Britain, too, faced this. Its financial might was built on the gold standard, a fixed, verifiable promise, yet the burden of empire proved too heavy. In 1914, to finance the Great War, Britain suspended the gold standard. The move was labeled temporary, but it was the point of no return. By 1931, the tie was definitively severed. The pound lost a quarter of its value overnight, an admission that the world's reserve currency could no longer keep its promises. America inherited Britain's financial crown, only to repeat the cycle with modern technology. In 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window. The dollar became a fiat currency, money by government decree, value by collective faith alone. This was the moment the ancient pattern completed its translation into the modern era. Since 1971, the US money supply has been increased more than 40-fold, and the dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power. The government discovered it could finance deficits and wars not by taxing, but by borrowing and, critically, by printing money into existence. This massive, continuous expansion of the money supply, digital debasement, is functionally identical to Rome's mixing copper into silver. The numbers get bigger, the coin gets smaller, and the trust erodes. Currency debasement is a quiet moral decay. When a government realizes it can create money without creating corresponding value, it inevitably does so, first to fund wars, then to buy peace, and finally to buy votes. The system is no longer built on tangible assets or fiscal discipline. It is balanced precariously on belief. And belief, as history shows, is the most fragile resource of all. When the American dollar, the supposed anchor of the global economy, finally falters, the resulting systemic shock will be commensurate with the scale of the empire it once served. The empire's heartbeat may still seem strong, but the very blood running through its veins is now diluted and fraudulent. The second major phase of the collapse centers on the empire's fatal addiction, debt. Debt begins as a solution, a clever tool to bridge the gap between ambition and reality. It ends as an unforgiving trap, enslaving the future to preserve a failing present. Rome's debt was not merely a financial problem, it was the structural weakness of the empire. The state owed its soldiers, its citizens, and its creditors colossal sums. Instead of raising the necessary taxes, which risked social unrest, Rome chose the easier path, borrowing and then inflating the currency to make the repayments appear smaller. This created a debt spiral. The state borrowed more to cover the interest on what it already owed, a cycle that required endless conquest to sustain the illusion. When the expansion finally stalled, the treasury was empty, the economy was hollowed out, and the debt spiral concluded not in orderly default but in political disintegration. Similarly, Britain, despite being the wealthiest nation in history by 1914, was financially fragile. 2 world wars transformed the empire into a borrower of last resort, primarily from the United States. Victory came at the cost of bankruptcy. By 1945, Britain's debt exceeded 250% of its GDP. For the next 50 years, the country was fundamentally constrained, paying interest on a war it had technically won but financially lost. The empire's fate was sealed not by the enemy U-boats, but by the merciless mathematics of the bond market. Debt is an invisible form of conquest, and it enslaved the British future to sustain the present. Following the end of the gold standard in 1971, the United States discovered the illusion of infinite credit. Every crisis, recession, war, pandemic, was met with the same single tool: more debt. The result is a figure that defies comprehension. The US national debt is now over 36 trillion, surpassing 120% of GDP. The most damning statistic of stage the was the US now spends nearly $1 trillion a year on interest payments alone. This figure exceeds the entire defense budget. The world's most powerful military empire is now spending more money paying for the financial mistakes of the past than it is on defending its future. The spiral is relentless. Every new dollar of debt yields a smaller return, meaning the empire must borrow more and more simply to maintain the illusion of growth and stability. This systemic borrowing breeds deep social and moral decay. It rewards speculation over hard work, shifts wealth from savers to financiers, and empowers politicians to make endless promises they know they will never personally finance. The debt spiral is the ultimate manifestation of shared denial. It is the point where collapse ceases to be a political question and becomes a matter of inevitable mathematics. The spiral will only tighten until the numbers stop adding up, and when that moment arrives, the implosion will be sudden and violent. This financial crisis is fatally coupled with the 4th stage, loss of productive capacity. The true wealth of a civilization is its productivity, the ability to turn labor and resources into tangible, necessary value. When an empire loses this ability, substituting output with consumption and borrowing, the core becomes hollow. As Rome became rich through conquest, its elite adopted a crippling mindset. Labor was dishonorable. Work was for slaves, not citizens. The empire began outsourcing everything: grain from Egypt, slaves from captured territories, textiles from distant provinces. Roman farms became estates of leisure, not production. The cities swelled with bureaucrats and a populace subsisting on the bread and circuses provided by the state. When the distant supply lines, which had been paid for with increasingly worthless currency, inevitably broke, the once mighty civilization could no longer feed itself. Its power was immense, but its productive purpose had evaporated. The British Industrial Revolution made the nation the undisputed workshop of the world. It produced steel, ships, and machines for the planet. But empire changed the incentives. Why innovate when you can simply extract? Why compete when you can control? Manufacturing slowly declined, replaced by the ascent of finance. The city of London became the heart of the empire, overshadowing the industrial might of Manchester and Birmingham. Britain ceased making things and started managing money. An empire run by accountants is one that ultimately ceases to build and therefore ceases to evolve. The United States embraced the same fatal illusion. The rise of globalization and the lure of cheap foreign labor led to systemic offshoring. Factories were moved to Asia, supply chains stretched across oceans. The American economy shifted dramatically from producing goods to producing debt and financial derivatives. Manufacturing, which accounted for 28% of GDP in the 1950s, plummeted to approximately 11% by the 2020s. Wall Street replaced Detroit as the nation's symbolic heart. Americans traded skills for screens, factories for financial apps, and production for perception. The result is an empire that consumes like a superpower but produces like a client state. It is now dependent on foreign goods and complex supply chains for its most basic needs, making it catastrophically vulnerable to global shocks. The loss of productive capacity is the silent killer, often masked by high market valuations and consumer credit. When the core is hollow, the empire lives as a parasite, sustained by systems it no longer controls and wealth it no longer generates. The ultimate tragedy of this stage is that the civilization loses not its wealth but its will. It mistakes endless movement and spectacle for genuine progress, paving the way for the final fatal stage. The collapse of an empire is not marked by the fall of its borders, but by the death of its spirit. The final stage is social decay. The moment a civilization loses faith in its institutions, its values, and critically each other. Rome's fall was a decades-long moral surrender. Citizens stopped joining the legions, preferring to pay mercenaries to fight their wars. The Senate became a pointless theater. The capital was consumed by breadlines, riots, and corruption. The empire that once united the world could no longer unite its own populace, who were deeply polarized by wealth, class, and purpose. When the Visigoths finally entered Rome in 410 AD, they did not conquer a superpower. They walked into a corpse that had already stopped breathing. The system was dead long before the physical structures fell. Post-World War II, Britain was defined by exhaustion and cynicism. Faith in leadership vanished amid persistent rationing, industrial stagnation, and endless strikes. The moral authority of the empire dissolved, replaced by a quiet surrender to apathy and class division. The military and economic decline was preceded by a moral decline, a civilization running on the faint memory of past glories rather than the momentum of present purpose. The United States today mirrors both historical precedents. It is the wealthiest society in history, yet it is consumed by unprecedented internal distrust. Political polarization is not a debate, it is cultural warfare. Addiction, chronic debt, anxiety, and declining birth rates rise together, all symptoms of a society that has lost its collective purpose. People no longer believe in their institutions, their justice system, or the viability of their future. The social contract, the invisible currency of civilization, is gone. The modern form of bread and circuses is endless digital spectacle. Media and social platforms keep the populace permanently distracted and divided, ensuring they remain blind to the structural cracks. As the infrastructure crumbles and the dollar inflates, citizens cling to normalcy, clinging to the comforting delusion that it can't happen here. But history cares nothing for pride. The pattern is clear. Expansion becomes arrogance. Money becomes illusion. Debt becomes addiction. Production becomes consumption. Truth turns to spectacle. The fall is not a sudden bang, it is a gradual drift into indifference and resignation. The ruins of Rome still stand, the dollar still circulates, the skyscrapers still rise, but they are merely monuments, not miracles. They are reminders that all great systems are temporary. The American empire is not waiting for Stage 5. Stage 5 is here. The decline follows a predictable and merciless pattern. The empire expanded beyond its means, Stage de Rouen, debased its currency, Stage 2, became addicted to debt, Stage 3, lost its ability to produce, Stage 4, and is now consuming itself through internal division and loss of meaning, Stage 5. The signs are not subtle. They are quantified in the $36 trillion debt and the 98% loss of the dollar's purchasing power. The US is on the same path as every great power before it. The only question remaining is whether we will finally read the warnings written in the past or pretend we are different until the pattern finishes its work. The end is not a hypothetical scenario. It is inevitable. It is mathematical. It is history.